A naval base outside St. Petersburg is on fire. Not a forgotten outpost, not a remote depot lost in the chaos of war. This is Kronstadt, a place that has long represented Russian naval power in the Baltic Sea, sitting just off the coast of one of the country's most important cities. And yet on this morning, something got through. Something small, unmanned, silent. And by the time Russia understood what had happened, the damage had already begun. Inside a dry dock that was supposed to be one of the most secure military facilities in the region, a modern Russian warship is burning. Its radar mast is collapsing inward. Its electronic systems are failing one by one, and its crew are left trying to contain a situation that is rapidly moving beyond control. But the most unsettling detail for Moscow is not just the fire. It is where the fire is happening. Less than 20 kilometers from St. Petersburg, inside a zone that Russian military planners have always described as layered, defended, and effectively untouchable. Yet something has reached it anyway, and it did not come from nearby. It came from over 1,000 kilometers away. Kronstadt is not just a naval base, it is a symbol. Sitting on Kotlin Island in the Gulf of Finland, it functions as the headquarters of Russia's Baltic Fleet and the primary defensive shield for St. Petersburg. For decades, Russian military doctrine has treated this region as a controlled maritime corridor, a place where surveillance is constant, where radar systems overlap, where coastal missile batteries, naval patrol routes, and air defense systems combine into a multi-layered defensive net. In theory, anything approaching from the west should be detected early, tracked continuously, and neutralized long before it becomes a threat. That is the image. That is the assumption. But assumptions in modern warfare are fragile because they depend on systems working perfectly under pressure. And on the morning of June 3rd, something inside that system failed. The day begins like any other at the Veliki dry dock facility. Workers arrive before sunrise. Equipment is checked. Maintenance schedules are followed. Routine operations begin in a place where routine is expected to mean safety. Inside one of the dry docks sits a Project 20,380 Stedogushchi-class corvette, a modern Russian warship designed for multi-role combat operations in the Baltic environment. It carries anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, advanced radar, electronic warfare equipment, anti-submarine warfare capability. On paper, it is a flexible, modern surface combat vessel. In reality, on this day, it is stationary, under maintenance, exposed in a way warships are never supposed to be exposed in a conflict environment. Because a ship in dry dock is not just inactive. It is dependent. It relies entirely on the assumption that the surrounding base will provide absolute protection. And Kronstadt is supposed to provide exactly that. As dawn breaks, reports begin to emerge of unmanned aerial systems entering the wider St. Petersburg region. These are not isolated incidents. They appear coordinated, multiple routes, multiple vectors, multiple potential targets. Some move toward industrial infrastructure, others toward energy logistics sites. And a separate cluster moves toward military installations near Kronstadt. For a brief period, there is no clear, visible interception reported directly over the dry dock area. No immediate anti-aircraft engagement. No obvious defensive response at the exact point of impact. And in modern warfare, that silence matters. Because silence usually means one of two things. Either the threat was detected too late, or it was not detected at all. Then the strike happens. The corvette inside the dry dock is hit, and then hit again. The explosions are not described as a single catastrophic blast that instantly destroys the ship. Instead, they trigger a rapid escalation of fire across the vessel's superstructure. Heat builds quickly inside the enclosed environment of the dry dock. Smoke rises. Systems begin to fail. Emergency response units are deployed, but the situation is already evolving faster than containment efforts. Because the damage is not limited to the outer hull, it is structural, and more importantly, it is internal. At the center of the ship sits one of its most critical components, the integrated mast. This structure is not just a physical tower, it is the brain of the ship. Inside it are the systems that allow the vessel to function as a modern combat platform. Radar arrays that detect incoming threats, communication systems that coordinate operations, electronic warfare equipment that disrupt enemy targeting, navigation systems that guide movement and positioning. When fire reaches this structure, the consequences are immediate and severe. Metal begins to deform under extreme heat. Internal systems fail in sequence, and slowly, the mast begins to collapse inward. This is the point at which a warship stops being a warship. Because modern naval power is not defined by hulls or armor alone, it is defined by perception. If a vessel cannot see, it cannot fight. If it cannot communicate, it cannot coordinate. If it cannot detect threats, it cannot defend itself. At this stage, the ship is still physically afloat, but operationally, it has already been neutralized. It is no longer a combat system. It is a structure, a platform without function. And in military terms, that distinction is critical. Because a sunk ship is lost, but a disabled modern warship represents something more complicated. It represents a permanent reduction in capability that cannot be quickly replaced or repaired, especially in a fleet where production constraints already exist. The Project 20,380 class is not produced at high volume. It represents a relatively modern segment of Russia's surface fleet, designed to bridge multiple combat roles in a single platform. But Russian naval industry faces long-term structural pressure. Shipbuilding capacity is limited. Supply chains are strained. Prioritization has shifted towards submarine programs rather than surface vessels. At the same time, technological dependencies that once involved external suppliers have been disrupted. In practical terms, this means replacement is not simple. Damage to a vessel like this is not just a battlefield loss. It is a logistical and industrial challenge that stretches beyond immediate repair capacity. But the significance of what happened at Kronstadt is not just about one ship. It is about location. Because Kronstadt is supposed to be one of the most protected naval environments in Russia, a zone layered with air defense systems, radar networks, coastal missile coverage, and rapid response capabilities. Yet during the strike, there is no clear indication of interception in the immediate engagement zone over the dry dock. That raises a difficult question. Was the defensive system overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous threats? Was there a gap in coverage? Or did the incoming systems exploit vulnerabilities that had not been fully addressed? The answer matters less than the outcome, because the outcome is that something reached the inner core of a highly sensitive naval base and executed a successful strike. And Kronstadt was not alone. Across the same period, other targets in the wider St. Petersburg region were reportedly affected. Industrial infrastructure, energy logistics facilities, military-related sites. What begins to emerge is not a single isolated incident, but a coordinated pattern of disruption. Multiple targets, multiple vectors, simultaneous pressure on different layers of infrastructure. This is not about one strike breaking through defenses. It is about multiple systems being forced to respond at once. And that is where modern defense complexity becomes a weakness. Because even the most advanced defensive network has limits when stretched across multiple simultaneous threats. What happened on June 3rd challenges a long-standing assumption that Russia's interior military zones, especially near major cities like St. Petersburg, remain effectively insulated from long-range disruption. Kronstadt disrupts that assumption because it demonstrates that distance is no longer a reliable shield. A strike originating far beyond immediate frontline zones was able to penetrate deep into a high-value military area and inflict operational damage. That changes the way security is perceived, not just in Russia, but across every military system that relies on geography as a buffer. By the time the fire is brought under control, the visual damage is already clear. A warship has been severely disabled, a key naval base has been penetrated, and a sense of vulnerability has been introduced into a system that is built on the idea of control. But this is not the end of the story. Because Kronstadt is not an isolated event. It is part of a wider sequence unfolding across multiple targets, across multiple locations in a single operational window. And once that pattern is understood, Kronstadt stops being just an incident. It becomes a signal. A signal that the nature of distance, defense, and vulnerability in this war is shifting faster than expected. And what comes next will... But as investigators begin reconstructing the sequence of events, a more troubling picture starts to emerge. Because the question is no longer how the strike happened. The question is why it was possible at all. For years, military planners around the world have measured security through layers. More radar, more missiles, more sensors, more coverage. The assumption has always been simple. If enough defensive systems are placed between a target and a threat, the target remains safe. But modern warfare is increasingly challenging that logic. Because the newest threats do not always arrive as large formations. They do not always announce themselves. And they do not always attack where defenders expect them to. Instead, they exploit attention. They exploit timing. They exploit the reality that every defensive network has finite resources. And on June 3rd, resources were being tested across multiple locations at the same time. While emergency crews continued battling fires near Kronstadt, reports from other sectors began reaching command centers. Additional drone activity, additional alerts, additional suspected targets. Each new report demanded attention. Each new contact required assessment, and every assessment consumed time. Time is the one resource modern defense systems can never fully replace, because a delay of seconds can become a delay of minutes, and a delay of minutes can become a successful strike. The deeper analysts looked, the clearer the pattern became. This was not simply an attack against a ship, it was an attack against confidence. Confidence in coverage, confidence in reaction time, confidence in the assumption that critical infrastructure remained beyond reach. That may ultimately prove to be the most important consequence of all, because military power is not only measured by hardware, it is measured by perception. A fleet does not need to be destroyed to become less effective. It only needs to be forced into caution. And caution carries a cost. More patrols, more inspections, more resources dedicated to defense rather than operations. Every hour spent protecting assets is an hour not spent projecting power. This is where the strategic impact begins to extend far beyond the dry dock itself. The Baltic Fleet already operates within a complex security environment. NATO's surveillance is constant. Maritime traffic is heavily monitored. Airspace activity is closely tracked. Now an additional challenge has emerged: the requirement to defend against persistent, long-range, unmanned threats. Threats that are comparatively inexpensive. Threats that can be launched from great distance. Threats that force expensive defensive systems to remain active around the clock. And that imbalance matters, because sustaining defense is often more difficult than conducting the attack. The attacker chooses the time. The attacker chooses the route. The defender must remain ready, everywhere, every day, for an unlimited period. As images of the damaged vessel continue circulating, military observers begin asking another question. What happens next? Repairing a modern warship is not like repairing a civilian vessel. Damage assessments take time. Electronic systems must be inspected individually. Structural integrity must be verified. Sensitive components may require complete replacement. Some parts can be repaired, others cannot. And even when repairs are technically possible, timelines can stretch far longer than expected, especially when industrial capacity is already under pressure. For now, official statements remain limited. Details remain contested. Different sources offer different assessments of the scale of the damage. But one fact remains difficult to ignore. The strike happened. The target was reached, and a location once considered among the safest military zones in Western Russia was forced into emergency response mode. That reality cannot be reversed, only managed, only adapted to, only learned from. And that is why Kronstadt matters. Not because it represents the largest strike of the war, not because it caused the greatest destruction, but because it illustrates a larger transformation taking place across the battlefield. A transformation where distance offers less protection, where infrastructure becomes a front line, and where small, unmanned systems can generate strategic consequences far beyond their size. The fire may eventually be extinguished. The ship may eventually be repaired. The base may eventually return to routine operations. But the underlying question will remain. If a target this deep, this protected, and this important can be reached once, who can confidently say it cannot be reached again? Determine whether this was a one-time breach